So if you follow my channel, you probably know that I recently went on a landscape photography trip out west here in the United States. I went to Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. And overall, it was a fantastic trip. I mean, it was probably like one of the best photography trips I've ever been on because, well, not just because I feel like I created some good images, but also because I didn't lose anything. I didn't break anything. It always seems to happen to me on these trips. And part of the reason why that trip was also successful, I think, and part of the reason why it just felt different to me and it felt like a very different kind of trip is because I was shooting with a different camera. This time I was shooting with a Fuji GFX 100S. I've talked about this camera a few times now. I've written about it as well. But now that I'm back home and now that I've been going through, all the hundreds of images that I captured with this camera, during that trip, I have some thoughts about, what's good about the GFX 100S and what's not so good. Let's begin with the good. The Fujifilm GFX 100S is a 102 megapixel camera, which is obscene, which is just an incredible amount of data, incredible resolution. At least it's obscene by today's standards. I mean, who knows, like 15, 20 years from now, maybe all cameras will be 100 megapixels by then, but by today's standards, it's a lot. And where you really see that and where that really comes through is when you're editing a raw file from the GFX 100S in Lightroom and you punch in, you start zooming into the image like 200%, 400%, and you just see more detail, more texture, which from a pixel peeping perspective is very satisfying. And that resolution has also made me really question whether I truly need this lens here. This is the GF 100-200 variable zoom telephoto. Nice lens in general. I mean, it's nice to have a telephoto lens, in my bag for certain situations where I would want it. But I shot like 98% of the time using the GF 32-64, which worked really well for me. And when you have 102 megapixels to work with, you can punch in and crop and effectively create a telephoto image. Obviously, there are some differences with things like compression and stuff like that. So it's not, it's not exactly the same. It's not, apples to apples here. But overall, I don't know. I didn't use this lens all that much. I'm starting to think maybe I need to unload this and maybe go for a wider lens because I felt like I needed a wider lens more than I needed a telephoto. Anyway, getting back to my point about resolution and editing in Lightroom, as awesome and as cool as it is to pixel peep and to zoom in and take a look at those details and textures, that increased resolution does have a practical use case. And for me, that is absolutely the ability to crop, because sometimes I might return from a trip, I might look at an image and I might realize it's a little bit off compositionally, or maybe there's like one particular area, like one small area within the image that it's kind of like where all the energy is, so to speak. I know that may sound weird, but you just feel it. Like you feel like there's one part of the image where it's interesting and everything else is just kind of superfluous and kind of meh, whatever. Well, in those situations, when you have 102 megapixels to play with, you can crop way in. As a matter of fact, you can crop a 102 megapixel file in half, like just cut it in half and still have like 45, 50 megapixels to work with, which is the effective resolution of this, Canon EOS R5 that I'm shooting with. Another good thing, something else that I've really grown to appreciate about editing raw files from this camera in Lightroom, I really do like the camera matching profiles in Lightroom that are available that match the film simulation or film emulation profiles that are built into the camera. I find myself using Provia on almost every single image because I really like the colors. I feel like it takes that raw data and it skews the hues in the direction that I would want them to go in anyway, and it provides like a really nice baseline for additional edits. And then there's Velvia, and Velvia is like, God, Velvia is crazy. Velvia is like an acid trip or something. I mean, it all depends on the image. Like some images, it looks pretty awful because it's very richly saturated because it's based on a color slide film, positive film. It's just too much red, too much purple a lot of times. But with certain images, it really brings out that color. And again, it provides a good baseline for additional edits. Classic Chrome is also nice. I don't think it's particularly well adapted for landscape photography. It's not my favorite for that, but I could easily see it being really useful for other types of images. Additionally, from a qualitative perspective, to my eyes at least, there truly is something different about the larger digital medium format sensor compared to full frame. I feel like there's better separation of foreground and background. The images just feel like they have more depth in them. Not to mention dynamic range as well. Dynamic range is excellent with these files. I feel like they have loads of latitude when it comes to being able to, lift the shadows and the blacks in the image and manipulate the highlights. They are very malleable. Now, of course, there are some people out there who claim that the medium format look is a myth. It doesn't really exist, that you can get the same kind of look with a full frame camera or otherwise. And I don't doubt those claims. Maybe those people are smarter than me. I don't know. But all I know is what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And after shooting with full frame for so long, it truly does feel like there's something different about these images. Okay, now let's talk about what's not so good. Bigger sensor, more megapixels means bigger image files, right? I mean, there's no way to avoid that. Raw files from this camera, once converted to DNG in Adobe Lightroom, they end up being on average like between 100, 110 megabytes per file, which is quite a lot if you don't have sufficient storage for files of that size. Fortunately, I do. I invested a while back into an OWC ThunderBay 8 DAS unit. It sits down here underneath my desk. Plenty of space. I have terabytes of space for all of my raw images from this camera. But where things start to get a little uncomfortable and where like my Mac Studio over here, where it starts to sweat a little bit, is when compositing these image files. Let's say that you go out and you do landscape photography like I do, and you create a bracketed exposure. You have 3 images that you need to combine together. Well, Adobe Lightroom Classic with the M1 Max Studio that I have here, it takes about 45 seconds to create an HDR image from those 3 individual files from the GFX. Whereas with my R5, well, those files took about 15 seconds to combine. So it takes a full 30 seconds longer to create an HDR file from images from this camera than my R5. Then once I have that HDR file and I've made some edits to it, and I then open that image in Photoshop for additional processing and editing thereafter, the file size just absolutely explodes. If I just make like a few additional adjustments, add a few layers, maybe do some dodging and burning, whatever it may be that I'm doing to the image, and then if I go and try to save that image as a PSD, I hit that 2 gigabyte limit really, really fast, and Photoshop's like, nope, can't do it. You have to save this as a large format document using this different file format. And there's nothing qualitatively or technically different between the PSD and the large document format file. They're both the same. It's just that large document format takes quite a bit of time in order to save, in order to open, and in order to work with. So the raw files are bigger, and the Photoshop documents are also much larger and more time consuming to work with. And then there is the problem with memory consumption. It is really struggling with images from this camera. I can have Lightroom Classic open, I can have Photoshop open, and I can be editing an image in Photoshop, but not much else. And that's when things start crashing, and that's when things just get really, really slow, and you start hitting some memory bottlenecks, and yeah, it's not good. And again, up until this point, like 32 gigabytes has been perfectly fine, but I'm now faced with, what to do. Now I have to, this was already expensive enough. I definitely do not need to be going out and buying like an M2 Ultra, something like that. I think the main problem though is memory. I think I just need more memory. I just really have to get 64 gigabytes, maybe even go all the way to 128. And then because it's Apple and because you have to buy Apple memory, it ends up being more expensive than it really should be, right? It's kind of the dark side of Apple, one of Apple's dark sides. But, at the end of the day, image quality is fantastic. That's what matters most. But I just don't think I appreciated in advance when making this switch. Like I knew file storage was going to be a thing, but I wasn't worried about that. I just didn't appreciate how intensive these files were going to be for the hardware that I'm currently running. So if you're considering making a similar change like I did in the future, also be thinking about what you're currently using to edit your images with, because you could be facing even more expense, and this is already expensive enough. Lord. So yeah, that's it. If you'd like to do this again, if you want to check out another video from me, I would recommend checking out this one here. If you have any comments, feel free to leave a comment down below. And while you're there, please take a moment, give this video a thumbs up. And if you'd like to hang out with me again, remember to subscribe as well. Thanks so much, everyone. I will see you next time.